Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take towering figures, complex ideas, and huge stacks of sources, and give you the necessary knowledge shortcut to truly understand them.
Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into one of the most celebrated, quoted, and yet I think consistently misunderstood figures in the history of American letters, Mark Twain.
Yeah, we're going far beyond the image of the beloved, witty humorist in the white suit.
Oh, way beyond.
That's right. We are peeling back that iconic image to reveal Samuel Langhorne Clemens, the genius literary innovator, the obsessive, failed entrepreneur who lost a fortune.
A massive fortune.
The pioneering technology enthusiast, and the scathing, radical anti-imperialist critic whose true thoughts were so politically charged they couldn't be published until decades after his death.
Our mission is to understand the full, complex spectrum of the man. The sources for this deep dive are truly extensive, covering the scope of his 74 years, from, this humble Missouri town of his childhood to the global fame he commanded.
We're tracking a man who essentially forged modern American literature out of the raw material of American life and language.
And the critical consensus on this is, well, it's absolute. William Faulkner, speaking of Twain, called him flat out the father of American literature.
And Ernest Hemingway was even more decisive in his judgment, claiming that all modern American literature comes from one book by Mark Twain called Huckleberry Finn.
I mean, when literary titans speak with that kind of certainty, you know you are dealing with a truly foundational figure. His influence is just impossible to overstate.
But before we even get into his writing, we have to start with the detail that is arguably the most famous and, frankly, unsettling anecdote about his life.
The incredible prophecy of his own death.
Okay, let's unpack this because it sounds like pure fiction, but the sources confirm it. It's a documented fact. Twain was born in 1835, just 2 weeks after Halley's Comet made its dazzling appearance.
Right. And as he aged, he formulated this spectacular, almost theatrical idea that he would go out with it upon its return 75 years later.
And this wasn't just a passing joke, was it?
Not at all. He wrote about it quite seriously in 1909, about a year before his death, giving his prediction a kind of cosmic, fatalistic flair.
He wrote, "I came in with Halley's Comet at 1835. It's coming again next year, and I expect to go out with it."
And he continues, "It would be the greatest disappointment in my life if I don't. The Almighty has said, no doubt. Now here are these two unaccountable freaks. They came in together, they must go out together."
The sheer confidence of that statement is just breathtaking. To publicly declare that your life is tied to a specific celestial event.
And guarantee yourself this perfect, dramatic final curtain. It's pure showmanship.
And what makes it so resonant is the fact that he died the very next year, April 24th, 1910, of a heart attack.
The sources note that this happened just one single day after the comet was at its closest approach to the sun.
It really makes you wonder how much of that was cosmic destiny and how much was his relentless will to control the narrative of his own life right up to the very end.
It speaks to the theatrical genius and the narrative control he maintained over his public identity. That prophecy truly sets the stage for the complexity we're about to explore.
Our mission is to move past the simple image of the humorist and understand the evolution of Samuel Clemens, the man who built that iconic identity. Let's start at the source.
Let's do it.
We begin with Samuel Langhorne Clemens, born November 30, 1835, in a tiny town called Florida, Missouri.
But the key move happens when he's 4. His family moved about 30 miles north to Hannibal, which was a bustling port town perched directly on the Mississippi River.
And Hannibal is everything. It's where the great geography of his imagination was formed.
Absolutely. It was a thriving, chaotic, often brutal river town, and it was this setting that he fictionalized as St. Petersburg, the hometown of Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn, in his major works.
So that move to the river, in essence, gave him the visual and linguistic landscape for his entire career.
But the idyllic literary image of Hannibal, it contrasts so sharply with his own early life struggles.
Right. His formal education, which is crucial context for understanding his intellectual power, was shockingly brief.
His father, who was a lawyer and a judge, died of pneumonia when Sam was just 11 years old.
And that loss immediately yanked him out of school. He had completed the 5th grade, and that was it.
He was forced to become a printer's apprentice to help support his mother and siblings. This abrupt transition placed him firmly in the working class, but it also, and this is key, it set him on the path of relentless self-education.
He didn't stay in Hannibal long, did he?
No, he worked as a typesetter and printer in major urban cities like New York, Philadelphia, St. Louis, Cincinnati.
And this experience in various newspaper offices and print shops, it must have exposed him to just a vast range of political, literary, and social ideas.
For sure. And because he worked during the day, his real education continued in the evenings, typically in public libraries, where he just devoured history, travelogues, and literature.
It's an inspiring narrative, really. The self-taught writer who learned not from textbooks in college halls, but from the demands of the press and the sheer breadth of public knowledge available in 19th century America.
The knowledge he gained on the job was crucial too, not just in terms of facts, but in terms of political awareness. He joined the International Typographical Union.
Which was a powerful, skilled labor organization.
Exactly. And his membership, which continued even as his career shifted, likely provided the foundation for the strong, radical pro-labor views he would express later in life.
But printing, however important, was only a means to an end.
The river.
Yeah.
He wrote in Life on the Mississippi about the singular, overwhelming ambition among his childhood comrades.
To be a steamboat man, it wasn't just a job, it was a destiny.
And within that world, the pilot was the aristocracy.
It wasn't just about the glory, though the prestige was enormous, surpassing even the captain in reputation and authority. It was about the income.
The sources highlight the princely salary, $150 to $250 a month, and no board to pay.
In today's money, that is a huge sum. A highly coveted, lucrative, and skilled position for a young man with no formal education.
The path to becoming a pilot was absolutely grueling, which only added to the prestige. He paid a mentor, Horace E. Bixby, $500.
Which was an enormous sum for the time, equivalent to about $18,000 today.
To teach him the 1,200 miles of river between New Orleans and St. Louis, he spent over 2 years as an apprentice learning the craft.
And learning the craft meant total immersion and absolute memorization. You couldn't rely on maps. The Mississippi is constantly shifting its channels, creating new sandbars.
He had to know every bend, every hidden reef, and crucially, he had to acquire a warm personal acquaintanceship with every tree, every snag, every landmark that lined the banks.
The sources emphasize the terrifying precision required. He must actually know where these things are in the dark, navigating entirely by memory.
Exactly. By the sound of the boat, the subtle shifts in the water's surface. The river was unforgiving. A single mistake could cost lives and tear the life out of the strongest vessel.
The mental discipline this required was immense, and it's no coincidence that a writer with this level of observation became a literary genius.
But this period also brought deep personal tragedy that marked him for life.
He convinced his younger brother Henry to work with him on the steamboat Pennsylvania, and in 1858, that boat suffered a catastrophic boiler explosion.
Henry was severely scalded and succumbed to his wounds 8 days later. It was an event that haunted Sam Clemens forever.
The sources indicate Twain was consumed by guilt, blaming himself for bringing Henry onto the river and onto that specific boat.
I mean, I can't imagine that kind of sudden, violent, self-attributed loss. It would fundamentally change a man's entire worldview.
And it certainly did for Clemens. Coupled with his claim of having foreseen Henry's death in a dream a month prior, this trauma sparked a lifelong, almost desperate interest in parapsychology.
Right, he became an early, serious member of the Society for Psychical Research, trying to scientifically understand or maybe just rationalize these moments of seeming precognition.
That tragedy, occurring during his time on the river, provides a dark counterpoint to the romance of the pilot life, and that career ended shortly thereafter anyway.
As river traffic was curtailed by the onset of the Civil War in 1861, but not before he acquired the identity that would define him.
Okay, let's dive into the origin of Mark Twain. It's one of the most famous pseudonyms in history, and it has this perfect functional nautical origin.
Yes, it's a cry from the past. It comes directly from the leadsman's signal, a sounding line. A rope with a weight would be used to measure the depth of the water.
Knots or colored markers along the line indicated various depths.
And when the line indicated a depth of 2 fathoms, which is precisely 12 feet, the leadsman would call out, Mark Twain.
And Mark Twain was the critical depth because it meant the steamboat was safely clear of the river bottom. It meant safe passage.
What's fascinating, though, is that the name wasn't entirely original to him.
Right. Twain later claimed he confiscated it from an older, respected steamboat pilot.
That pilot was Captain Isaiah Sellers, who wrote accurate, practical river information and reminiscences for the New Orleans Picayune newspaper under the signature Mark Twain.
And this is where the young Sam Clemens, still finding his voice, took a sharp, aggressive turn into satire.
He wrote a rude and crude satire, ridiculing Sellers' quiet, reflective reminiscences, and published it.
And Sellers, who was a highly respected older gentleman and sensitive about his writing, never published another word under that name.
Twain felt immense remorse and guilt over this early journalistic aggression later in his career, stating that he had caused pain to a man he respected.
But, realizing the signature had been abandoned, he decided to lay violent hands upon it without asking permission. He first signed a humorist travel account, Mark Twain, on February 3, 1863, while working in Nevada.
It shows that even in his genesis, he was willing to use humor and journalistic force, sometimes to the detriment of others, but always with an eye toward finding the most memorable, distinctly American voice possible.
It's also worth noting he used far less successful names before settling on the iconic one.
Oh yeah, like Josh for humorous sketches and Thomas Jefferson Snodgrass for a series of early letters.
Thomas Jefferson Snodgrass doesn't quite have the same ring to it.
Not quite. With the river closed by the war, Twain moved west in 1861 to join his brother Orion, who had been appointed the Territorial Secretary of Nevada. This travel became the subject of his book, Roughing It.
Before he fully embraced the West, the sources confirm a brief but notable detour, a 2-week stint in the Confederate unit, the Marion Rangers.
A very short stint. He described this quickly abandoned attempt at military life in his sketch, The Private History of a Campaign That Failed, essentially admitting he was ill-suited for soldiering.
So the move west led him eventually to the silver mining town of Virginia City, Nevada, where he tried his hand at becoming rich on the Comstock lode.
And he failed miserably as a miner, quickly transitioned back to journalism, and found employment at the Territorial Enterprise. This is where the name Mark Twain first entered the public consciousness.
But the breakthrough that made him a national and soon international sensation came after he moved to San Francisco in 1864. He was sent to Angels Camp, California, where he heard a fantastic story at the Angels Hotel about a jumping frog contest.
And that tale led to the celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, which was published in the New York weekly The Saturday Press in 1865.
The story was an immediate sensational success across the country. It was fresh, hilarious, and it captured a raw American vernacular that resonated instantly.
It's the perfect culmination of his early life, taking raw, local American material, drawing on the colloquial speech he mastered on the river and in the mining camps, and delivering it with that distinctive, hilarious voice.
By the mid-1860s, he was no longer just Samuel Clemens, printer or pilot. He was Mark Twain, the national humorist, ready for the next phase of his life: domesticity and fame.
And with his national reputation secured by the Jumping Frog story, his career just took off, transforming him into a travel writer.
This led to a funded trip aboard the Quaker City in 1867 for a tour of Europe and the Middle East, which generated his first massive bestseller, the travelogue The Innocents Abroad.
It was on that trip that he met Charles Langdon, who showed him a photograph of his sister, Olivia.
And Twain claimed to have fallen instantly in love after seeing the picture, which led to one of the more improbable courtships in American history.
Oh, she initially rejected his proposals. She viewed him as a rough-edged jokester, but his persistence won her over.
They married in Elmira, New York in February 1870, and the Langdon family was tremendously important to Clemens's intellectual development.
They were wealthy, but also deeply liberal and abolitionist. And through Olivia and her family, Twain met and socialized with influential abolitionists and social reformers.
People like Harriet Beecher Stowe, Frederick Douglass, and the writer William Dean Howells.
Their social life reflected this progressive environment. In 1873, the Clemenses moved to Hartford, Connecticut, which was becoming a literary and intellectual center of the country.
They built a lavish, architecturally unique home right next door to Harriet Beecher Stowe. This period, the 17 years spent in Hartford, became his golden age of writing and creativity.
The family also spent their summers at Quarry Farm in Elmira, where Olivia's sister built him an octagonal gazebo study.
Specifically so he could have a quiet, dedicated space for writing and, notoriously, for smoking the 20 to 40 cigars he consumed daily.
This prolific period in Hartford established his global legacy. It produced his core classics, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer in '76, The Prince and the Pauper in '81,
Life on the Mississippi in '83, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn in '84, and A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court in '89.
And many of these works use narrative genius to deliver powerful social commentary disguised as humor. The Prince and the Pauper and later Pudd'nhead Wilson both deploy the trope of switched identities,
which allowed him to explore societal rigidities, the cruelty of class distinctions, and how identity is arbitrarily assigned by birth, not merit.
And A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court is particularly interesting, not just as a humorous novel, but because it established a trope now fundamental to genre fiction.
Right, the protagonist, Hank Morgan, is a time traveler who uses his modern scientific knowledge to dismantle and lampoon Arthurian social norms, effectively serving as an early satirical example of speculative fiction or alternate history.
And this leads us directly to the other side of Twain's genius. The inventor and technology enthusiast, he was genuinely fascinated by and often obsessed with the mechanics of science and engineering during the Gilded Age.
Here's where it gets really interesting. He maintained a close and enduring friendship with one of the greatest scientific minds of the age,
Nikola Tesla.
Nikola Tesla. Twain spent a great deal of time in Tesla's laboratory, acting as a kind of celebrity hype man for the future of electricity.
Yeah, the sources even mention film footage of Twain visiting Tesla's lab in New York, helping demonstrate his inventions. It's clear they bonded over a shared vision of technological progress.
And Twain wasn't just an admirer. He was a creator. He was the kind of person who saw a minor inefficiency and felt compelled to solve it.
He patented 3 inventions in his life. He devised garment straps meant to replace suspenders, which didn't catch on, and a history trivia game, which was too complex.
But his most commercially successful invention was the self-pacing scrapbook.
The genius of that scrapbook was its absolute simplicity and utility. It had dried adhesive pre-applied to the pages that only needed moistening before use.
No more glue pots. It was brilliant.
The source notes that he sold over 25,000 copies of it. He could solve a household problem brilliantly, even if he couldn't solve major industrial problems.
He was also, remarkably, a forensic visionary, an early, vocal, and enthusiastic proponent of fingerprinting as a forensic technique.
Long before it was widely adopted by law enforcement, Twain didn't just mention it. He actually incorporated it into the plots of 2 major works.
That's right. He used it first in Life on the Mississippi in 1883, and then made fingerprint evidence the central, climactic plot device in Pudd'nhead Wilson in 1894.
It shows an astonishing foresight. Using a cutting-edge scientific method in literature to solve a crime years before police departments globally fully embraced it. It speaks volumes about how plugged in he was to the emerging technological landscape.
Unfortunately, that futurism and enthusiasm for innovation led directly to his colossal financial ruin.
Despite earning substantial money from his prolific writing and hugely successful lecture tours, he had terrible, tragic luck choosing which industrial inventions to back.
The main culprit, the invention that became a millstone around his neck, was the Paige Compositor.
A mechanical typesetter. Twain believed this machine would revolutionize the publishing industry and make him wealthier than any writer in history.
He was completely dedicated to it. He sank an astronomical sum into its development and refinement. $300,000 between 1880 and 1894.
Let's pause on that number for a moment because it's hard to grasp the scale of this loss in the late 19th century.
$300,000 in 1890 is the equivalent of approximately $9.7 million in today's currency.
Nearly $10 million lost on a single, ultimately failed piece of technology.
The machine itself was a marvel of complexity, involving 18,000 separate moving parts. It was precise, but notoriously prone to constant breakdowns.
And incredibly expensive to maintain and fix. But here's the critical difference that explains the failure. The Paige Compositor aimed to replicate the manual process of handling individual letters.
While its competitor, the linotype machine, which emerged later, didn't attempt to handle individual type at all. Instead, it cast an entire line of type a slug at once.
The linotype was structurally and mechanically far simpler, cheaper to manufacture, and much more reliable.
So the linotype rendered the Paige Compositor completely obsolete before it could ever be perfected or produced commercially.
Twain's machine was beautiful, complicated, and utterly doomed by a simpler, superior piece of engineering.
Imagine pouring nearly $10 million, your family's security, your life's earnings, your wife's inheritance, into a single investment, only to watch it get outmoded and fail.
The sources detail the immense creative and psychological toll this took on him. The pressure was suffocating.
And compounding his problems was his publishing venture, Charles L. Webster and Company.
It was started primarily to publish his own books, but expanded quickly. It had an initial colossal success by publishing the memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant, which made a fortune for Grant's widow.
But the firm failed soon thereafter, mainly due to poor management and ill-fated projects.
Notably, losing substantial money on publishing an authorized biography of Pope Leo XIII, which, despite the high hopes, sold fewer than 200 copies.
Ouch. So by 1894, Twain had lost the bulk of his book profits and his wife's inheritance due to the machine and the failing publishing house. He was devastated and filed for bankruptcy.
This is a crucial pivot point where we see the measure of the man. His friend, the Standard Oil executive Henry Huddleston Rogers, stepped in.
Rogers was instrumental in helping Twain manage his finances, first having him transfer the copyrights of his works to Olivia to protect them from creditors.
Which secured the family's future income stream. But the truly defining ethical moment of this period was Twain's unwavering commitment to repaying every single dollar.
He was no longer legally required to pay his debts due to the bankruptcy filing, yet he felt a profound moral obligation to his creditors.
So he accepted an offer for a year-long, arduous, around-the-world lecture tour starting in July 1895.
This was a physical trial for him. He was 60 years old and suffered greatly from illness, including a persistent carbuncle, a severe, painful skin infection throughout the journey.
The tour was relentless, taking him across North America, the Pacific, to Fiji, Australia, New Zealand, Sri Lanka, India, Mauritius, and South Africa. He performed constantly.
And his 3 months spent in India became the centerpiece of his 712-page travel book, Following the Equator.
This global effort was an astonishing display of integrity and perseverance. By mid-1900, he returned to America, having lectured and written enough to pay off every creditor in full.
He had transformed his personal financial catastrophe into an ethical triumph, proving that while his business sense was terrible, his commitment to his word was absolute.
When we transition from Mark Twain, the humorist and failed investor, to Mark Twain, the political critic, we observe a man whose ideology was constantly evolving and often radically accelerating through the traumas of the Gilded Age and the rise of American imperialism.
And he was acutely aware of this personal shift. He offered his own assessment in a letter to his friend, William Dean Howells, in 1887.
Right. He noted that he had changed little by life and environment and had evolved from a moderate Girondin to a radical sans-culotte, even identifying himself as a Marat.
This needs a little context.
Yeah.
The Girondins were the moderate conservative faction during the early stages of the French Revolution.
And the sans-culottes were the working-class Parisian revolutionaries, the radicals. And Jean-Paul Marat was the most extreme and fiery Jacobin writer, an advocate for revolutionary violence.
He was stating, in the language of revolution, that he had gone from a cautious moderate to an outright ideological radical.
Driven by his observations of wealth inequality and political corruption in America, his early positions were far more conservative, reflecting his Southern pre-war roots.
He was a Republican for most of his life, initially supported classical laissez-faire economics, believed political rights were secondary to property rights.
And he admired self-made plutocrats like Rogers, though he despised political corruption, which led him to break with the Republican Party in 1884 to join the Mugwumps.
But his working-class roots as a printer and river pilot strongly informed his changing stance on labor. He wrote glowingly about the power and honor of trade unions in life on the Mississippi.
His support extended to the major labor movements of his time, specifically the International Typographical Union and the powerful Knights of Labor.
The Knights of Labor, active in the 1880s, was one of the first truly national unions, advocating for the 8-hour day and worker cooperatives.
Twain was passionately supportive of their goals, arguing fiercely for greater economic equality. He asked, who are the oppressors? The few. The king, the capitalists, and a handful of other overseers and superintendents.
And he clearly identified the oppressed as the many, the nations of the earth, the valuable personages, the workers.
So what does this all mean politically? It means he was arguing that if existing laws and constitutions allowed for this profoundly unfair division of wealth, then the laws and constitutions themselves should change to ensure a more nearly equal division.
That is a truly revolutionary socioeconomic critique for his time.
This radicalization came to a devastating head on the issue of imperialism. This is perhaps his most shocking immediate reversal.
Initially, he supported American expansion, backed interests in the Hawaiian Islands, and even enthusiastically called the Spanish-American War in 1898 the worthiest war ever fought, believing it was purely to liberate Cuba.
But by 1899, less than 2 years later, he was completely disillusioned, his opinion violently reversed.
He described his political awakening in the context of the Philippine-American War, stating that he had realized the U.S. did not intend to free, but to subjugate the people of the Philippines. We have gone there to conquer, not to redeem.
The shift must have been immediate and overwhelming once he recognized the brutality and the economic motives behind the expansion.
So he went from supporting the war to serving as vice president of the American Anti-Imperialist League in just 3 years.
From 1901 until his death, he became the country's most visible, vocal, and famous opponent of the Philippine-American War and global colonialism. He used his immense fame as a weapon.
His satirical attacks were devastatingly effective because of his platform. He published To the Person Sitting in Darkness in 1901, where he scorchingly suggested a flag for the Philippine province under American control.
Just our usual flag, with the white stripes painted black and the stars replaced by the skull and crossbones.
Just brutal. And what's fascinating here is how he globalized his critique using his travel experience.
In 1905, he published King Leopold's Soliloquy, written as a dramatic monologue where the Belgian king defends himself against accusations of genocide in the Congo Free State.
The format was brilliant. It exposed Leopold's hypocritical use of religious rhetoric and modernization to mask systematic slavery and murder.
This pamphlet was widely distributed and contributed directly to the international outcry, arguably the first large-scale modern human rights movement that eventually forced the Belgian government to take direct control of the colony from the king in 1908.
He didn't spare American institutions either. He turned his pacifist anger toward organized religion and war in his short story, The War Prayer.
Well, the story argues that for Christians to pray for victory in war is inherently barbaric, because implicit in that prayer is the request for the enemy's destruction, poverty, suffering, and death.
He argued that Christianity and humanism are utterly incompatible with the conduct of war.
And he was so acutely aware of its controversial and anti-establishment nature that when Harper's Bazaar rejected it in 1905, he wrote to a friend, "I don't think the prayer will be published in my time. None but the dead are permitted to tell the truth."
And he was right. It remained unpublished until 1916. He was, in his final years, a truth-teller who understood his own time could not handle his truths.
Moving beyond foreign policy and war, his commitment to civil rights was equally fervent. He was an adamant supporter of abolition and emancipation, stating powerfully that Lincoln's proclamation not only set the black slaves free, but sent the white man free also.
But his support was actionable, not merely rhetorical. He put his own money behind his beliefs.
Right, paying for at least one black person to attend Yale Law School and another to attend a Southern university to become a minister. For a man who had declared bankruptcy, this was a significant financial sacrifice toward equality.
He also publicly criticized the judicial system's failure to protect non-white citizens, particularly in the West, noting he had seen Chinamen abused and maltreated. But I never saw a Chinaman righted in a court of justice for wrongs thus done to him.
And he actively supported women's rights, giving the Votes for Women speech in 1901.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Twain's trajectory is remarkable. He started in a slave state, surrounded by early prejudices and conservative ideas, yet became one of the country's most active and radical proponents of racial and social equality.
However, we must address the complicated nuance in his views, particularly concerning Native Americans, which demonstrates that his evolution was neither clean nor simple.
This is a really important point. The source material reveals a significant, almost jarring contradiction that highlights the ingrained racism of the 19th century that he struggled to overcome.
His 1870 essay, The Noble Red Man, written before his political radicalization, is extreme and disturbing.
He reflected a view of essentialized racial difference and openly advocated for genocide, describing the Native American as the scum of the earth, whom to exterminate were a charity to the Creator's worthier insects.
That essay was meant to be satirical, but its underlying prejudice was raw and clear. It sought to undermine the sympathy felt on the Atlantic seaboard for Native Americans, arguing they were irredeemable savages.
Even 2 decades later, in 1895, he was still ridiculing authors like James Fenimore Cooper for being unrealistic about Indians, arguing they were seldom sane.
But then, we see the profound impact of his global lecture tour on his worldview. By 1897, in his travelogue, Following the Equator, written as he toured the world to pay his debts, we see a dramatic shift.
He moves from local American prejudice to a scathing, cynical, global critique of white hypocrisy.
This exposure to colonialism firsthand forced him to look outward. He concluded that in colonized lands all over the world, the so-called savages have always been systematically wronged by whites in the most merciless ways imaginable.
He observed the robbery, the humiliation, and the slow murder through poverty and the white man's whiskey.
His final assessment, based on years of travel and observation, is highly provocative. He noted that the white man's notion that he is less savage than the other savages is a humorous thing, an absurd piece of hypocrisy.
He effectively reversed his earlier views, concluding that colonial whites were the true villains perpetrating the most organized savagery.
So you see the extreme, ugly prejudice of his early roots, battling the radical humanitarianism and global consciousness he developed later in life. This contradiction is essential to understanding the complex evolution of Mark Twain.
Twain's literary legacy rests entirely on his mastery of American style. His distinguishing feature was his revolutionary ability to render colloquial speech, the language of the river, the mining camp, the common person.
And popularize a distinctive American literature built on American themes and, crucially, American language.
This raw, realistic approach is exactly why Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is often called the great American novel.
However, this same realism, which includes rendering the exact dialect and slurs common to the 19th century South, is precisely why the book remains constantly restricted and banned in American high schools for its language, specifically the use of the racial slur nigger.
Now, we mentioned his wife Olivia earlier, but her role in his creative output was essential. The sources confirm she acted as his de facto editor and censor throughout their 34-year marriage.
This internal censorship is critical for evaluating his true radicalism. Olivia was liberal but extremely Victorian in her sensibilities. She smoothed out Twain's rough edges, forcing him to remove jokes and sections she deemed too vulgar or religiously offensive.
So it suggests that the Twain the world knew during his peak fame was, by necessity, a filtered, commercially viable version.
And it was only after Olivia's death in 1904 that he began publishing or attempting to publish the work she had looked down upon. This led to a flood of post-mortem radicalism.
Let's look at the works that were suppressed or significantly altered. Several key anti-religious works were kept from the public eye for decades because they were just too radical for the era.
The Mysterious Stranger, which features Satan visiting Earth and offering deeply cynical anti-humanist philosophy, was published in 1916. Little Bessie, a short story ridiculing core concepts of Christianity, wasn't published until 1972.
And the collection of essays, Letters from the Earth, which contained some of his most polemical anti-religious writings, was only published in 1962.
Decades after his death, when his surviving daughter Clara finally relented, she had previously suppressed them due to concerns about their extreme anti-clerical tone.
So much of what we consider to be the true, cynical Mark Twain was something the world simply wasn't allowed to read for a century.
But amidst all this suppressed material in his famous novels, what did he, the ultimate critic, consider his personal favorite work? It wasn't Huck Finn or Tom Sawyer.
Twain claimed personal recollections of Joan of Arc was the work he was most proud of. This seems like an almost deliberate misdirection, given his satirical output.
He was obsessive about the book, viewing it as his only truly serious historical work. He claimed to have spent 12 years preparing and 2 years writing it, relying on detailed historical sources.
He insisted it be published anonymously so that readers would accept it as a serious historical account rather than dismissing it as a humorous joke.
He even stated, "I like Joan of Arc best of all my books. It is the best. I know it perfectly well."
That dedication to history and reverence stands in stark contrast to his usual cynical satire. And it was published right at the time of his bankruptcy, a moment where he desperately needed a successful book to save his finances.
His final major literary output was his autobiography. Twain dictated it in a highly unconventional, rambling, and non-chronological style.
Believing this format would be the most entertaining and truthful way to capture the scattered nature of human memory.
It certainly was unconventional, and he put a massive embargo on it. Per his explicit wish, the first volume was published 100 years after his death, in November 2010.
And it was an immediate, unexpected international sensation, a bestseller.
It made him one of the very few authors in literary history to publish new best-selling volumes across 3 different centuries, the 19th, 20th, and 21st.
That kind of longevity, a century after his passing, is remarkable proof of his enduring appeal and the power of his voice.
But when people picture Mark Twain, they almost universally picture him in his trademark white suit.
Let's unpack this popular image because it's a piece of calculated self-mythology. The sources note that modern representations suggesting he wore white suits his entire life are completely unfounded.
It was actually a relatively late-life habit. The white suits became his personal uniform on the lecture circuit only after Olivia's death in 1904.
He wrote that his advanced age afforded him the privilege to wear white year-round, rejecting the depressing captivity of the shapeless and degrading black ones, which were the standard, somber, formal wear of the era.
It was a conscious, deliberate statement, a rejection of convention and somberness. He famously wore a white summer suit to a congressional hearing during the dead of winter, simply because he could.
It was his signature, a personal brand adopted late in life to symbolize his freedom from social constraints.
And speaking of his final years, we must return to the beginning, the Halley's Comet prediction. The theatricality of his life needed a dramatic conclusion, and he certainly provided one.
Let's reiterate that incredible quote one last time. I came in with Halley's Comet in 1835. It is coming again next year, and I expect to go out with it.
He wrote that in 1909, staking his entire identity on the return of that celestial body.
And Twain died peacefully of a heart attack in Redding, Connecticut on April 21st, 1910, just a single day after the comet was at its closest proximity to the sun.
The world recognized the significance of the timing. The tributes poured in immediately.
President William Howard Taft offered an assessment that beautifully captures his dual nature, noting that Twain gave pleasure, real intellectual enjoyment to millions, and that while his humor was distinctly American, his works were appreciated worldwide.
His final resting place is in Elmira, New York, in the Langdon family plot. And his surviving daughter, Clara, ensured that the monument marking the plot stood 12 feet tall.
A precise physical representation of the two fathoms, the Mark Twain measurement that gave the pilot his identity and the writer his immortal name.
It was the perfect final nod to the river that shaped him.
So what does this deep dive reveal about the complexity of Mark Twain? We've seen the extraordinary journey of Samuel Clemens, the poor printer who, through sheer discipline, became the prestigious steamboat pilot.
The genius humorist whose disastrous financial failure, that staggering $9.7 million loss on the Paige Compositor, forced him onto an arduous global literary tour to pay off debts he didn't legally owe.
And we've tracked the passionate radical critic who moved from supporting plutocrats and war to fiercely opposing colonialism and becoming vice president of the Anti-Imperialist League, dedicated to fighting for labor rights and equality.
He was a revolutionary, a humanitarian, a tech fanatic, and a humorist, all rolled into one fiercely contradictory personality.
He was a man of intense contradictions, whose literary legacy, the very foundation of American letters, was often tempered and censored by his fear of offending the establishment, or perhaps more accurately, the delicate Victorian sensibilities of his wife.
And this is our final thought for you to carry forward. Twain's most frank, brutal views on religion, views that were published in his autobiography 100 years after his death, stated unequivocally that Christianity, with its invention of hell as a doctrine of terror, was so terrible that neither the deity nor his son is a Christian, nor qualified for that moderately high place.
That is radical anti-religious polemic, a fundamental rejection of the faith that underpinned his society. Knowing that the sharp, satirical genius you admire was also a radical, controversial critic whose strongest, most revolutionary opinions were suppressed for decades, how does that change the way you view his classic American works today?
Are Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn just funny, nostalgic stories of boyhood, or were they perhaps the safest, most publishable versions of a much darker, much more revolutionary mind desperate to speak truth to power?
Something to consider as you dive deeper into American literature. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.
We'll catch you next time.